Hello, everybody. This is Mike from the On the Stack podcast at icewarm.org/magic. Going to be taking an in-depth look at the commander deck I talked about on episode 9. This is the white-blue commander deck. So we're going to start off with the lands. We have 20 islands, and we have 10 plains. And into the non-basic lands, I have 1 Academy Ruins, tap for colorless, and I can also pay 1 in a blue to bring an artifact from my graveyard and put it on top of my library. I have 1 Reliquary Tower, so I can basically skip my discard phase with this because it makes it so there is no maximum hand size. I have 1 Ruins of Trocaire. It comes into play tapped. I can tap it for 1 white, or I can sacrifice it to sacrifice it and tap it to add 2 white to my mana pool. We have 1 Strip Mine, which taps for colorless, and I can also sacrifice it to destroy another land. We have 1 Savulite Temple. It's exactly like the white land. It comes into play tapped. I can tap it for 1 blue, or I can sacrifice it to add 2 blue. I have 1 Tranquil Cove. Comes into play tapped, and I can I gain a life when it comes into play, and I can tap for either white or blue. And we have 1 Visura, which when it comes into play, I can copy any other land that's already in play. So I can copy like a Reliquary Tower. My opponent controls that, or even copy a Strip Mine and sacrifice that. It's a pretty interesting land because it lets you copy any other land that's in play. Let's take a look at the creatures. We have 1 Angelic Skirmisher. And it's a 4/4 flying creature, and it gives either First Strike, Vigilance, or Lifelink to creatures I control. Gain that ability until the end of turn. So if you're low on life, you want to pick Lifelink, or if you want to be able to block, you can put Vigilance on it. If you want to do damage first, you can pick First Strike. It's pretty interesting because it adds that ability to your other creatures. You have 1 Avatar of Will, which is a total of 8 mana cost, 6 and 2 blue. However, if an opponent has no cards in their hand, it costs 6 less to play. So I can basically play it for 2 mana if somebody has no cards in their hand, and it's a 5/6 flyer. Pretty good. I have 1 Aven Surveyor. It's a 2/2 flying creature, and when it enters play, I can put a 1/1 counter on it, bringing it up to a 3/3, or I can return a target creature to its owner's hand. It's a good way to get stuff off the battlefield, especially if it's something that's been like loaded up with a lot of equipment. Or if I want to even return one of my own creatures that has an empty enters the battlefield effect that I want to repeat. We have 1 Battlefield Thaumaturge. It's a 2/1, and it makes instants and sorceries cost 1 less to cast for each creature it targets. So if it's a thing that targets multiple creatures, you can lower the cost by even more than just 1. The Battle-Wise Hoplite. It's 1 in a blue for a 2/2 with Heroic. So whenever I cast a spell that targets it, gets a 1/1 counter on him, and then I can also scry 1 by looking at the top card of my library and deciding to put it either on top or the bottom. We have 1 Crafty Path Mage. So 1/1, and it can also tap to give a creature that has power 2 or less unblockable, and we'll get to why that's important in just a few more creatures. We have a Gulf Squid, which is a 2/2, and when it comes into play, I can tap all of my opponent's lands. So basically, I can make it so they can't cast instants on my turn and stuff like that. We have 1 Midnight Guard, a 2/3, and the interesting thing about him is whenever another creature enters the battlefield, I can untap Midnight Guard, and that's my creatures and my opponent's creatures. So he can untap basically whenever a creature is played, pretty much. We have a Mind Scour Dragon, the 4/4 flying dragon, and whenever it deals combat damage to an opponent, that player puts the top 4 cards of their library into their graveyard. We have a Monastery Mentor, just a 2/2 with prowess. So whenever I cast a non-creature spell, he gets a +1/+1 counter, and whenever I cast a non-creature spell, I can put a 1/1 white monk into play as well. There's a Mystic of the Hidden Way. This is a 3/2 creature that is unblockable. We have Aljautai, Soul of Winter. This is actually the deck's commander. It's a 5/6 dragon with vigilance, flying obviously. And whenever a dragon I control attacks, I can tap a non-land permanent somebody else controls, and it doesn't untap during their next untap step. That's a good way to basically make it so something can't attack you, or something can't block you either. Have a new Prav Guildmage. which is a 2/2, and it can give a target creature flying to obviously make something harder to block, or I can pay 5 to detain something. The detainment basically means something can't attack or block or activate its abilities for a whole turn. And here is why the Crafty Path Mage works out on this next card, which is the Raven Guildmaster. It's a 1/1 creature, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, that player puts the top 10 cards of their library, removes them from the game. So we exile 10 cards, pretty much. If this thing is unblockable, it basically means they're going to just lose 10 cards every time it attacks, which is good. We have one Reveille Squad, which is a 3/3, and if you're attacked and this card is untapped, I can then untap all the other creatures I control. We have a Rootwater Thief, which is a 1/2, and it can gain flying for 1 blue. And whenever it deals damage to a player, I can pay 2 mana, and then I can search their library for a card and exile that card from the game. A good way to get rid of stuff that you don't want in the game at all, especially if you're able to actually have control over which card it is. We have one Sage Owl, 1/1 flying, and it lets me basically rearrange the top 4 cards of my library. I can look at them and put them back in any order. We have one Sandstep Outcast, which comes into play, and I can either put a 1/1 counter on it, or I can put a 1/1 spirit creature with flying onto the battlefield. We have one Spiketail Hatchling, which is a 1/1 flyer, and I can also sacrifice it to counter a spell unless an opponent pays 1 mana to cancel that. And we have the Spiketail Drake, which is a 3/3 flyer, and I can also sacrifice the Drake to counter a spell unless the person that playing the spell pays an additional 3 mana. So, the creatures are designed around being unblockable to, cause damage and to also, especially with the Raven Guildmaster, to get rid of cards. And onto the enchantments, we have one Abduction, so I can take control of a creature until it dies, and when it does die, it goes back to its original owner. I have one Alexi's Cloak, which gives I can play, and it can also be played with flash, which means I can play it whenever I can play an instant, and the target creature can't be the target of spells or abilities. That's something I would put on the Raven Guildmaster as well. I have one Awesome Presence, which basically says enchanted creature cannot be blocked unless defending player pays 3 mana for each creature that blocks it. That's a good way to mess with their mana. And Evanescent Intellect, which gives a creature the activated ability of paying 1 in a blue, tapping it, and then the target player puts the top 3 cards of his or her library into her graveyard. A good way to remove stuff from people's decks. I have one Protective Bubble, which is an enchantment, and the enchanted creature is unblockable, and it also gains Shroud, so it can't be the target of spells or abilities. You have one Psychic Venom, so you basically enchant a land, and whenever your opponent taps that land for mana, it will cause 2 damage to that land's controller. So basically, it's a way to kind of like shut down certain lands from being used, unless they want to pay the 2 life to do it. Here's Quiet Contemplation. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, I can pay 1. And if I do, I can tap a target creature, and it doesn't untap during its next untap step. We have Heuristic Study. So whenever an opponent casts a spell, I can draw a card unless that player pays 1 additional mana. And here's a Robe of Mirrors, and this also gives a creature Shroud, so it can't be the target of spells or abilities. I'm going to move into the instants. We have an Annul, which counters target artifact or enchantment. A Cancel, which is counters target spell. Counterspell to counter a spell. Disdainful Stroke, which is counter target spell with mana cost 4 or more. Dominate, which allows me to gain control of another target creature, and it does this effect does not end at the end of your turn, so it's permanent, and then when that creature dies, it's unlike Abduction that the creature just goes to the graveyard instead of going back to its owner. We have one Enlightened Tutor, which allows me to search my library for an artifact or enchantment, reveal it to everybody, and then shuffle my deck and put that card on top of it. It's a good way to get your artifacts out, and we'll get to the artifacts in just a little bit. I have one Infiltrate, which makes the target creature unblockable for a turn. So again, use it with the Raven Guildmaster to attack and have them, get rid of 10 cards. A Mirror Strike. So target unblocked creature deals combat damage to its controller. Set it to you. This works really well in Commander because I've used it in a few games where something swung at me for a lot of damage, and I played this, and then that player got damaged instead. Really great card in Commander. Here's a Mystical Tutor. So search your library for an instant, interrupt, mana source, or sorcery, and reveal it. Shuffle your library and put that on top of it. This is a great way to get something like the Enlightened Tutor into your hand. So if you want the Enlightened Tutor, you use this, reveal the tutor, and then put it on top of your library. There's a Negate, which is counter target non-creature spell. This deck has a lot of counter spells in it. A Nullify, which counters a target creature or aura enchantment spell. We have a Pillar of Light to exile target creature with toughness 4 or greater. A Psychic Spiral, which lets me shuffle my graveyard into my library, and then target player puts that many cards into their graveyard from their library. So if I had 10 cards in my graveyard, that means that I can shuffle those back in, and the other player will have to put 10 cards from their library into their graveyard. So, like this deck is good at getting cards out of people's libraries. We have a Rakshas's Disdain, which says I can counter a spell, and unless the opponent pays 1 mana for every card in my graveyard, it gets countered. A Reality Shift, which lets me exile a target creature, and then that player manifests the top card of their library, and it becomes a 2/2 creature. So if somebody has a powerful creature, you can play this and replace a powerful creature with basically a 2/2. You have one Refocus, which lets me untap a creature, and then lets me draw a card on top of it. I have a Remove Soul, which counters a target creature spell. Rethink, which basically says I can counter a spell, and the opponent basically has to pay double for it. So it says counter target spell, unless its controller pays X, where X is its converted mana cost. So if they pay 4, and I play this, they essentially would have to pay 8 to cancel this Rethink card. A Supplant Form turns the target creature to its owner's hand, and I get a copy of that creature, or a token that's basically a copy and does the same things. This is really great with Counterspell because you copy the creature, and then the next time they play it, you just cancel it. So basically, you're playing with their cards, and they don't even have them. You have an Unsummon to return the target creature to its owner's hand. View from above, it gives a target creature flying, and if I control a white permanent, I return this card to my hand, and the flying is only until the end of turn. But since there are white creatures in this deck, you can basically keep playing this card over and over again. We have a Whisk Away, and target attacking or blocking creature gets put onto it on top of its owner's library. Get to why that's good in a second. I have a Withdraw, which returns a creature to its owner's hand, and then unless they pay 1 additional mana, I return another creature to their hand. Into the sorceries, I have 1 Denying Wind. It's expensive. It's a 9 mana cost, but it lets me search my search target player's library and remove 7 cards from the library from the game. Divination, just a good draw spell, 2 cards. Dream Cache says draw 3 cards and choose 2 cards from your hand and put them on the top or bottom of your library. So if you have cards in your hand you don't really want, you can draw 3 and then put two that you don't need on top of your library, or even if you want them later, you can put them on top. Have a Mana Vapors, so lands target opponent's control don't untap during their next untap step. So if they're tapped out, you play this, and basically they have no mana for their next turn. Here's a Relearn. Return target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. So obviously if you wanted to use the Enlightened Tutor again, you would just use this and bring the tutor back. A Tidal Surge, which lets me tap either 1, 2, or 3 creatures without flying. And a Time Ebb, which puts any one creature on top of its owner's library. And we're going to move into the artifacts. So the Time Ebb and the Whisk Away work really well with this artifact, the Millstone. So what I've done in the past when I played this deck before is I've returned something to the top of their library, played this, and then paid 2 mana, tap this artifact, and remove. Basically, those cards get put into the graveyard. We also have an Icy Manipulator, which lets me tap something, a creature, artifact, or land. We have a Hero's Blade, which gives a creature +3/+2. It can attach free to a legendary creature, And if I can pay 4 to attach it to something else. And finally, we have the Deserter's Quarters, which is a 2 mana cost, and you can choose not to untap it during its untap step. And if you do that, you can pay 6 mana, tap it, and tap a target creature, and that creature doesn't untap during its controller's tap step as long as Deserter's Quarters is tapped. Basically, that's a good way to essentially have a creature that basically can't do anything. It won't be able to attack or block. It's tapped with this artifact, or some of the other stuff that lets me tap the creatures. And that is the basics of how this deck works and the cards that are in it. If you want a full deck list, you can go to icewarm.org/magic, and the deck list is in the show notes for episode 9. Just click on that. It'll bring up the deck on deck stats, and you can take a look at the deck. And I want to thank you all for watching. And again, if you like these videos, you can support them on Patreon at patreon.com/icewarm. Thanks again for watching.